Okay, welcome back once again. This is going to be an interesting topic for the week of March the 1st to March the 5th. All right. How do you guys and girls feel about studying the law? Well, this week you're going to get a chance to do just that. Study the law, and you're going to see how it's going to affect you, or how it has affected you. So what I'd like you to do is there's a couple assignments I want you to take a look at. The first one, there's a GIM kit here, a link, and this is just an optional thing. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. Take a look at that if you have some time this week. I think it's going to be pretty fun. I think you're going to like it. One thing that I'm requiring you to do is to learn about Ojibwe treaty rights. All right, and the first question I have for you is, does a treaty signed over 100 years ago still matter today? So, what you got? What I have for you are 3 PDFs on this page at the bottom here. These attachments, I should say. I want you to look at these 3 PDFs. Okay? And after you read them, I'd like you to answer these 2 questions. Explain exactly how Ojibwe reserved rights work, in your opinion. And what exactly is the Ojibwe ceded territory? Okay? Then there's a Ojibwe spearfishing controversy video. All right, this is all true stuff, and this is pretty real. And this is something that's affecting you and I, especially people who live in northern Minnesota. The Ojibwe signed treaties in 1837, in 1847, 1855, 1854, 1866, 1889, and 1863 in what is now called the state of Minnesota. And what they did is they agreed to give up their land to the United States government. But what they did not agree to give up, and what they held on to, were certain rights and privileges. And these rights and privileges we're going to be talking about. These rights and privileges were guaranteed from the treaty. And a lot of people don't know about these rights and privileges. In fact, these people are really upset that the Ojibwe have these rights and privileges. And unfortunately, the Ojibwe were getting into trouble because people did not know about these rights and privileges. You, on the other hand, are going to learn about these rights and privileges so you can understand why they exist. So, without any further delay, let's go ahead and get to the assignment. So, first thing I want you to do is take a look right here at this first page. Oops, wrong one. Ojibwe treaty rights. Okay, treaty rights. I'm going to read this aloud to you, and please read it yourself too. Treaty rights. Today, treaty rights means those rights the Ojibwe kept when they signed the treaties. These rights are called reserved rights. Okay? I turned my pen on. Reserved rights. Okay? So the Ojibwe sold their land in a treaty, right? A treaty is an agreement made between 2 or more groups. In this particular case, it was the Ojibwe and the United States government. We've been talking about treaties this whole chapter. We just got done talking about the Treaty of 1851 of Traverse de Sioux between the Dakota and the United States government. Now we're talking about the Ojibwe and the United States government. Remember, Ojibwe lived in the northern part of Minnesota, and Dakota lived in the southern part. So the Ojibwe never sold or bargained these rights away. They are the rights. What are these rights, you're asking? They are the rights to hunt, to fish, and to gather plant resources, like wild rice, on the land sold to the United States. Okay? So they agreed to sell their land, but they never gave the right to hunt, fish, and gather plant resources away. They never gave these rights away. And the United States government said, sure, you can keep these rights. That goes back to 1837. Holy cow, that was a long time ago, people. Back then, there weren't that many people living in what is now state of Minnesota. So, I'm going to ask you in the assignment, what exactly are treaty rights? And I'd like you to answer with this. Those are the rights that the Ojibwe kept when they signed the treaties. Okay? So let's take a look at how these treaty rights, or we call them reserved rights, work. Okay? So this is an interesting example. For example, your parents may have some land they want to sell. Okay? However, they've been told there's gold on the land. They don't want to lose the gold, but they don't want to keep the land either. So when they sell the land, for example, let's say there's a house on the land. They've been living in that house for 20 years, and they go ahead and they sell the house and the land the house is sitting on. Well, there's gold on that land. They want to sell the place. They've been told there's gold on the land. They don't want to lose the gold, but they don't want to keep the property either. So what they get to do? So when they sell the land, they keep or reserve these are called mineral rights. They just sell the surface of the land. That means that they reserve the right to come back after they sell the land. They reserve the right to come back and mine for gold on that property. That's totally legal to this day. Okay, so this gives them the right to mine the gold or other underground minerals, even though the surface of the land belongs to the new owners. This is true. So these are called reserved mineral rights, and treaty, hunting, fishing, and gathering rights are a type of property right. They're not special rights. These are just a property right, okay? Given to Native American Indians. But a property right, which is common, these are not special rights given to Indians, but a property right, which is common to all citizens of the United States. Okay? All right, so we've just discovered what treaty rights mean. Okay? So we can go to Schoology. What are reserved rights? I would like you to tell me how they work in your opinion. We know what reserved rights. These are the rights the Ojibwe kept when they signed the treaties. All right, I'd like you to tell me in your own words though. All right, so now we got to look to see what exactly is Ojibwe ceded territory. All right, let's come back. Whoops. Hang on to that thingy so we can come back to it. There we go. Thank you very much. Back to notability. All right. So unfortunately, the reserved treaty rights of the Ojibwe were ignored for many years. So the Ojibwe reserved these rights. They kept these rights to hunt, fish, and gather plant resources as they had traditionally done since 1837. Let me fix that. It's kind of written badly. All right. The government said you can have these rights way back in 1837. Unfortunately, the reserved treaty rights of the Ojibwe were ignored. Ignored. You guys know what that means. People just forgot about it. State governments simply forgot about the treaty rights of the tribes. Did they still exist? The answer to that is yes. So the states made rules and regulations, and they forced the tribes to follow those rules with no regard to the treaty agreements. Okay. Next. In recent years, the tribes have gone to court against states to prove that their treaty rights have always existed. Court decisions from the United States Supreme Court have agreed with the tribes that they did indeed keep hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on the lands that they sold. The Supreme Court ruled, that's the United States Supreme Court ruled, that the tribes should be able to use these treaty rights as long as the natural resources are also preserved and public health and safety are protected. Okay. One more. So, what are ceded rights? Or what is ceded territory? Excuse me, I'm sorry. What is ceded territory? So, to exercise a treaty right means that the Ojibwe people can go off of their reservations. So, remember, the Ojibwe and the Dakota agreed to sell their land only if they got reservations in which to live. Now, they kept their rights to hunt, fish, and gather plant resources off of their reservations. Off. To exercise a treaty right means the Ojibwe people can go off their reservations to hunt, fish, and gather, and they do these activities under tribal, not state law. This is tribal self-regulation. For example, the treaty deer season is different than the state deer season because it's under tribal laws. All right, you and I are not members of the Ojibwe Nation. If we are to go deer hunting, we have to follow Minnesota state deer hunting season. Okay? If you're an Ojibwe and you're hunting on ceded territory, you are allowed to follow tribal laws, not state laws. More on that a little bit later. So what is the ceded territory? Well, the ceded territory means the land sold under the different treaties. For the Ojibwe, this is the northern third of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The Ojibwe can only exercise their treaty rights within the ceded territories. So what is ceded territory? It's land sold under the different treaties. So this is land that used to belong to the Ojibwe that they sold to the United States government. That's the ceded land. Okay? And this ceded land exists in northern Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin, but for our purposes, we're just talking about Minnesota. The treaty rights also apply only to those specific lands sold within a specific treaty. For example, the 1837 treaty refers to lands in the east central part of Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. This means that an Ojibwe person hunting under the 1837 treaty cannot use the treaty rights to hunt in parts of the state not included in that treaty. So, for example, if you're a fisher person, you like to fish, and you want to fish for walleye, you and I, we're not Ojibwe, we cannot go spearfishing for walleye here in southern Minnesota. If we did, we would get in big trouble. It's against state fishing rules. However, if you're an Ojibwe and you're living on ceded land, ceded territory, that lands that they sold to the United States government, they don't have to follow the same fishing rules you and I do. All right? So, for instance, they cannot go to northern Minnesota to hunt under 1837 treaty rights because those lands were not sold under the 1837 treaty. So, treaty rights are tribal rights. So, Ojibwe treaty rights belong to the tribe, not to individuals. For example, chiefs representing 8 Ojibwe bands in Wisconsin and Minnesota signed the Treaty of 1837. In this treaty, the Ojibwe kept their hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. Only members of these tribes who signed the treaty can hunt under the 1837 treaty. They can only do so under tribal regulations. The Ojibwe bands regulate treaty hunting, fishing, and gathering. So tribal members must follow the rules and regulations that are part of tribal law. So they still have rules to follow, but it's not the state of Minnesota's rules. It's their own tribal laws. So a person must also be an enrolled member of the Ojibwe band that signed the treaty. For enrollment as a tribal member, you must prove your Indian ancestry, including parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. So what does this mean? This means that if you are on Lake Mille Lacs, which is on ceded territory, they can hunt, fish, using different rules than what non-Native Americans have to follow. And that gets people really upset. They can also go on people's land in the ceded territory and hunt and fish without permission. It's not trespassing because it's on ceded land. That also gets people upset. So, I would like you to now write down what ceded land is. We just talked about it. Then, what exactly is Ojibwe ceded territory? Then, I would like you to go to the link on this page, right here, and visit that video, Ojibwe Spearfishing Controversy, which it just pulls up right there. Watch that, please, and I want you to answer these two questions. Do you agree or disagree with the fact that Ojibwe were allowed to keep their traditional method of hunting, fishing, gathering on ceded lands by the United States Supreme Court? Why or why not? And what are some of the consequences of allowing the Ojibwe to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded lands? I'm talking a lot of people getting very upset about this on both sides. So I want you to look at this, and I want you to tell me what you think about it. Okay? All right. If there's any questions, please let me know. Have a good